to speak after the member for Rushcliffe. Mixed because I agree, obviously, with much of what he's got to say, but could never possibly match the way in which he says it. Mr Chair, first of all, I'd like to go through the business of moving the amendments in my name, in particular Amendment 167 and the other amendments in my name, as well as those amendments in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber. Perhaps in this kind of debate, I'd also like to maybe be able to bring both sides of the House together by, first of all, taking the opportunity to wish Finland a very happy 100th birthday today, and all Finns in the UK and around the world a happy 100th Independence Day today. Finland, of course, is a fully sovereign and independent nation and a member state of the European Union to boot, demonstrating that the two are entirely compatible. Once again, the Finns providing a lesson for us all. Finland, as a historical footnote, Finland actually declared independence at a time of political mayhem in the state from which it seceded. Of course, there's always lessons from history for us all there. Today's debate is, of course, set amongst the chaos of the Prime Minister's inability to get a deal on Monday. We were promised that there would be a coalition of chaos after the election, and that's one promise that, to be fair, the Prime Minister has been able to keep. If I can move on to New Clause 70 and the extraordinarily powerful speech by the Member of Parliament for North Down. I think it was an extraordinary speech, and I hope that all members, even those who may not agree with her, listened closely to what she had to say. I know that we did, and other members and other parts of the House did as well, which seeks to preserve the principles of the Good Friday Agreement. Years of hard work have gone into peace in Northern Ireland, and I think that was notified with powerful speeches across the chamber. And of course, it would be remiss of me, and I hope colleagues from Northern Ireland won't mind me mentioning, that of course the St Andrews Agreement, which was part of that process, which was signed in my own constituency, and I know members were there at the time. Given the precious goal of long-term peace in Northern Ireland, I think it's astonishing that this legislation has failed to address the issue, and even at committee stage, we're having to remind the government of its responsibilities. I think this is reflective of wider issues in terms of devolved administrations and this bill. But if I can reflect, it was the previous member for Murray, Angus Robertson, who raised this point of problems at the Irish border earlier on this year. And I think he was right to raise those points. And the Prime Minister told Angus, just as Vote Leave told us, that there was nothing to worry about. I bet the Prime Minister wished that she'd listened to Mr Robertson at that time, and that there was plenty to listen about. Mr Robertson wasn't alone. The Select Committee for Exiting the European Union noted in its report published last week, and I hope members of that committee won't mind me quoting it, to see how leaving the customs union is reconcilable with the imposition of a border. And the report concluded, in the light of the recent statement from the Irish Government about the border, ministers should now set out in more detail how they plan to meet their objective to avoid the imposition of the border, including if no withdrawal agreement is reached by 29th of March 2019. And I know that's something that the Minister will be keen to tackle when he speaks shortly. On Monday, the Prime Minister travelled to Brussels looking at a deal with regulatory alignment. It is not for me to comment on when other members may or may not have seen that and what discussions were had. I'm sure they will take the opportunity themselves. But we on these benches think that regulatory alignment is actually quite a good approach. Of course, it was about a year ago when the Scottish Government first proposed such a resolution in the publication of Scotland's Place in Europe. I think it's also notable that in that publication we took on board the views of other political parties, of experts, because actually we're okay with listening to experts on the issue of Europe on these benches as well, and I think it's something the Government would do well to listen. Of course, we believe that remaining in the single market would make it a lot easier for the UK Government, as well as giving the certainty to business and the economy. But I think it would also be helpful in terms of Northern Ireland. I noticed Peter Haynes' comments yesterday of former Labour member, where he called on the Prime Minister to keep the whole of the UK in the single market and the customs union in order to avoid sacrificing the Good Friday Agreement. That's obviously a position that we in the SNP would wholeheartedly agree with. We recognise in the SNP the historic and constitutional importance of Good Friday Agreement, and we will vote to protect it tonight if the Honourable Lady for North Down pushes it to a vote. Can I just make one point in the member for North Down? I want to pay tribute to her tireless efforts. There are areas that she will often disagree with us and many members of this House, but, Mr Chair, there are inherent dangers if this government views of the DUP. They should, of course, take on views of the DUP, but of all political parties. And I pay tribute to her efforts to make sure that there is as strong a possible voice for everybody in Northern Ireland. And that might make uncomfortable listening for me to listen to sometimes and for others across this House, but is extraordinarily important, and I pay tribute to her for doing so. On our amendments, and some of these points have been raised by the member for Cardiff South and Penarth. Madam Chair, Mr Chair, I turn to the amendments in my own name, and those at 166, 167, 170, 171 and 174. Amendments 166 and 167 were put together by the Scottish and Welsh Governments and confer further powers to legislate and give Scottish ministers the ability to make their own amendments to the directly applicable EU law. The ability of Scottish ministers to have these powers is vital for the proper functioning of the Scottish Parliament, but also keeps consistency of law where you have different legal systems across. I see the honourable member for Oakland South Perthshire shaking his head. Of course, this isn't just a view shared by me, but of course shared by other members, and one shared by the Law Society of Scotland as well, of course. Amendment 167 gives Scottish ministers the ability to make different change in Scotland where Scotland's circumstances require it. That, after all, Mr Chair, was the entire point of having a devolution settlement in the first place. Preparing our laws for exiting the EU will be technical, but it will require significant policy choices, such as those over environmental areas where organisations like SEPA will cooperate with their counterparts in Brussels directly. And actually that brings one point, and I'm sure the Minister will deal with this. One matter we'll have to address is readying for exit is who should replace the EU regulators within the UK. We're not entirely clear on that. It might be technical, but it's an extraordinarily important part. But I'm sure the Minister will pick up on that as well. Amendment 167 expresses deep concern from the devolved administrations that if only UK ministers have the ability to make fixes in EU regulations, then the UK governments could subsume powers back from Brussels and act as regulator for the whole of the UK in relation to the area of devolved policy. And again, environmental standards, that's incredibly important. In terms of the additional joint amendments in my name, those at 170, 171 and 174, these aim to ensure that devolved ministers should have the same powers in respect of matters falling within devolved competences as UK ministers are being given in clauses 8 and 9. Now, as the bill stands, if the need arose to deal with the power to make subordinate legislation in the devolved area, the bill would require Scottish or Welsh ministers to go to the UK government to ask permission for them to do it on their behalf, which is clearly something that's not acceptable to the devolved administrations and not acceptable to members across this House. Amendment 170 would lift this unnecessary restriction on devolved ministers' powers. It would equalise the powers between UK government and devolved administrations and give each their proper role for reserved and for devolved laws as well. And to give everybody a little break, I'll give way to the honourable member.
Given the thrust of his amendments, has it occurred to him that these powers were ceded to the European Union in order to maintain an integrity of the internal market? Equally, when these powers return to the United Kingdom, there will be a need, in the interests of many Scottish businesses, a need to maintain integrity of the United Kingdom market, which is of vital importance to the Kingdom of Scotland.
Mr Chair, I have many facepalm moments when it comes to Tory Brexiteers, and that was another one. I mean, to compare the internal market of the European Union with its independent member states with that of the United Kingdom is quite astonishing and demonstrates the lack of understanding of the EU that lay at the heart of vote leave and continues to lie at the heart of these arguments. It also misunderstands the state of the United Kingdom now. It is not the same state as it was 40 years ago. Devolution, whether you agree with it or not, and I know there are many on those benches who would rather we didn't have devolution, agree with it or not, has changed the framework in which the United Kingdom exists. And it is the point made, and the honourable gentleman makes the point, that we must have these powers devolved to the Scottish Parliament to make them work. And I'll give way to the honourable member.
Very grateful for the honourable gentleman, and when it comes to many of these matters, we agree. But I have to take him up on this. It's not on to say that honourable members on these benches do not agree with devolution. Let's be quite clear. We do, which is why we happily voted for an act, I think it was in the last Parliament, that conveyed even more powers of devolution onto the Scottish Parliament.
Thank the honourable member for her point. I think that's why I said, and I should be clear, that maybe some of those members have maybe not come to terms with the devolved administrations. And the bill gives the UK, and actually, if ministers have come to grips with it, believe in devolution, believe that devolution should exist within a devolved settlement, then they will back our amendments.
Yes, exactly.
And if they do back our amendments later on today, then that's something they'll be able to prove me wrong in my point.
Yes.
And I look forward to them backing our amendments and doing so later on today. Now, the bill gives, not at the moment, so I want to move on. There's plenty to go through. The bill gives UK, Scottish and Welsh ministers the power to make instruments needed to ensure that our laws are still compliant with international treaty obligations when we leave the EU. However, unlike UK ministers, the bill as drafted means devolved government cannot use this power to amend directly applicable EU laws. And Amendment 171 aims to rectify this, which of course we'll be backing now. Amendment 174 is equally important. In fact, it would be good to understand exactly what's going on with the UK's position on Amendment 174. The bill gives UK, Scottish and Welsh ministers the power to make instruments needed to implement the withdrawal agreement. However, unlike UK ministers, devolved administrations cannot use this power to amend directly applicable EU laws, and this amendment would rectify that anomaly as well. The power restriction to one side, the UK Government has planned to introduce separate primary legislation on the withdrawal agreement. I'm wondering if the Minister can tell us what purpose then does A clause 9 actually serve, and B, will the Minister explain how this restriction on devolved administrations can exist to give effect to the withdrawal? That these amendments put together by the but actually drew together support from across this House, and if members don't mind me saying so, that wasn't the most important part. The most important part were Scottish and Welsh Government officials sitting down together, not always easy, with SNP and Labour colleagues sitting down, and to be fair, Plaid Cymru colleagues in Wales having significant input into that as well, to pull these together. And I hope that the Minister will give them some serious thought, because this is a way. I don't want to leave the European Union, but this is a way of compromise. Now, the honourable member for BrExit, she may disagree with me in some areas, but where we do agree is that we are both willing to compromise on this. Now, the Minister needs to look at it. If the Minister is serious about the devolved administrations still working after devolution, I would urge him to look at these amendments. Now, turning to the devolved delegated power. Has gone on at Holyrood, and I know this is something that members such as Liberal Democrats, Labour, the Greens and others have raised. A lot of discussion has gone on and consultation with Scottish ministers, members of other political parties to try and reach some consensus. On difficult issues like this, I think that is a good way to try and reach out, and I commend Scottish ministers for having done so. I also commend opposition politicians in the Scottish Parliament for having sat down and tried to reach an agreement with this. I thought that was a responsible thing to do. Once again, I think the devolved administrations leading where Westminster should perhaps follow. The Scottish Government, as a result of that, is committed to working with the Scottish Parliament and its committees to agree a set of principles and a process that will ensure that the instruments that are made under the bill receive the appropriate scrutiny. We hope the UK Government will do the same for the UK Parliament. And we on those benches look forward to those discussions. And again, I'm wondering if the Minister can tell us what plans he has to reach a consensus across this House. Indeed, and I'll give way on that point.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And isn't this one of the key differences, I think, the undertakings that the Scottish Government has given about how it will use the delegated powers that we're seeking through these amendments, as opposed to the naked power grab that the Henry VIII clauses that will come on another day of this bill are being taken by the UK Government.
Yes. Well, my honourable friend for Glasgow North makes a very, very good point about the power grab, but of course members do have the opportunity to prove us wrong. wrong, back the amendments that have been drawn together in a cross-party way, and I very much look forward to doing so. And I'll give way to the honourable member on that.
I am grateful to the member for giving way. When we speak about power grab, can you confirm that the power grab that the SNP want is for Scotland to become independent and give all these powers that you want back in Scotland straight back to the European Union?
On a day that Finland celebrates its 100th birthday as an independent sovereign state, where they have no problem with full membership of the European Union, with the sovereignty that comes with it. Now, where I concede is sharing sovereignty is sometimes okay. Now, there are members and the member for Murray on your back benches who may not agree with that. We've got members, but sharing sovereignty in areas with the European Union is a good thing. On areas like trade and the environment that benefit his own constituency as much as they benefit mine as well. And on these areas, these are crucial areas where we do not have a problem with sharing sovereignty, and where we'd have our own say, where fishing, for instance, becomes a political priority in a way it never was a political priority for the United Kingdom government. And in terms of, I'm going to move on, but in terms of that, I would like to see the honourable member, of course, come forward with some amendments. The Secretary of State said to us today there would be amendments. I was very disappointed that Scottish Conservative members, who have their misgivings, and I accept that, and they've made some valuable points, but I was very disappointed that they've not come forward with any amendments themselves. I thought that was remiss of them, especially at a time when we're able to work on a cross-party basis to do so. But to move on, I want to, because there is quite a lot of technical stuff in this, but the SNP has tabled amendments in the name of Ian Blackford, which delete the word appropriate and insert the word necessary. I think this is relevant to the delegated powers. This recommendation came not from the SNP, not from Labour, not even from the Liberal Democrats or anybody else, but came from the Law Society of Scotland. And we've been happy to work with external stakeholders who I will concede know a great deal more about this than I do, and I'm always happy to take guidance and advice when it comes to these issues, and I would recommend that's something that all members should think about doing. Indeed, the need to rein in the meaning of the word appropriate was first highlighted by the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution, who published their report on the Great Repeal Bill and delegated powers back in March and gave credence to amending the legislation, with particular attention to the use of the word appropriate in that report. The committee suggested in the House of Lords a general provision be placed on the face of the bill to the effect that the delegated powers granted by the bill should be used only so far as necessary to adapt the body of EU law to fit into the UK's domestic legal framework, and so far as necessary to implement the result of the UK's negotiations with the EU. Our consequential amendments, and I'm almost there, Mr Chair, our consequential amendments on 209, 210, 212, 213, 214, 215 take into account those House of Lords recommendations. I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome amendments for the honourable member for Aberavon, who I believe is seeking to achieve a similar outcome as these benches on his own amendments. There are outstanding concerns in practice how powers excluded from the Scottish ministers may work, and I know a number of private international law instruments may need specifically Scottish adaptations given the separateness of the Scots law and the Scots judiciary. It's clear the bill needs significantly amended. When you have senior legal experts speaking out on almost every single clause, you do start to wonder if we should continue the bill or just start again from scratch. But we are where we are with this, and I hope that ministers will take on board these amendments that do not just come from political parties, but come from across the board. And before I conclude, I will give the member the opportunity.
Very much. It's a privilege to speak here, and thank you very much for letting me intervene. Be in no doubt, amendments can't be a Trojan horse, and it can't frustrate the democratic will of the people of the United Kingdom. So the question is really simple. Does he accept that the European Withdrawal Bill is necessary and that it is largely procedural?
I think, as a member of the Parliament, as any member of Parliament, we should just not be incumbent upon us to pass any old law that the government wants us to pass. If this place does not believe that the law is fit for purpose, does not believe the bill is fit for purpose, then we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to interrogate. And actually, as I would make the suggestion to the honourable member, you are allowed to make amendments. That's something that you, as a member of Parliament, can do. There are hundreds of amendments. Many of them have gone down in colleagues from this side of the House, but also from every single side of the House. And I hope that, in due course, the Scottish Conservatives will start making amendments to bills. That's something that an MP is allowed to do. So I would encourage them to do so. But if we do not think a bill is fit for purpose, we will not vote for it, and I would not expect any other member to do so either. In conclusion, and if I may, I would like to pay tribute to the work of Scottish and Welsh officials in particular, who over the past few months have worked so hard on this. Often those of us who are discussing these amendments in Parliament do so at the end of a process, but there are officials in the devolved administrations and elsewhere working extraordinarily hard on this. The Secretary of State for Scotland said earlier on today that he will bring amendments 500+ days on from the EU referendum, and I'm glad to hear it. I'm wondering if the Minister will tell us when he will bring forward those amendments when he rounds up today. Finally, on a historical note, I noticed that Brexiteers were hailing Henry VIII as a great Brexiteer earlier on. Henry VIII was never King of Scots, but he was responsible for the rough wooing of Scotland. And on that point, finally, I'll give way to Honourable Member Cameron.
I'm not going to woo him, but I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Of course, Henry the Tudors, of course, originate from Wales, which I'm sure he Tudor, and all the connections there. However, I just wondered as well, before he concludes, whether he agrees with me that, given that we've heard the Secretary of State of Scotland talking about amendments to Clause 11, that if we don't get the changes on Clause 10, that he would welcome, like I have suggested, a vote on Amendment 158, possibly 159, on making sure that they cannot just amend the Scotland and Wales Acts willy-nilly.
I'm glad that the honourable member made what I'm sorry will be the final intervention, because he makes an excellent point, and I agree with him wholeheartedly and thank him for bringing it up. Henry VIII's Welshness does not excuse the rough wooing, nor does it excuse the Henry VIII powers which are taken by this bill. We have to learn from history. We also have to learn from bad legislation. Significant amendments need to be made. This bill is not fit for purpose as it stands, and I look forward to an extensive speech from the Minister when he will raise the many points that have been raised. And finally, we also stand ready, should Lady Herman wish to push, the member for North Down wish to push her clause to a vote later on as well.